I will be reading Acts 15:39 through 40. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord.
Good morning. Good to be with you. Thank you for being here. Appreciative of your presence with us, especially our visitors. We're glad that you've chosen to be with us. If you don't know, we're going through the book of Acts in this Sunday morning series this year with the idea of simply being a Christian. And if you have been here over and over every Sunday morning, I'm sure you're tired of hearing that. But either way, we're still going to keep doing it. Over halfway through in our study in Acts. And today, we begin in Acts chapter 15. We begin the second missionary journey here in Acts chapter 15 at the end. If you remember, what kickstarted all of this was a letter that was composed by the elders and the apostles in Jerusalem as to what do we do now with the Gentiles now that they have come to know Jesus, they've been baptized, and now they're living from Jesus. What do we do with them? What are their obligations, especially in regards to circumcision and the law of Moses? So we were sent out with a letter of encouragement and the obligations from that particular meeting, which kickstarted this journey. And at the beginning here, at the outset, what Joel just read for us is a disagreement. The first missionary journey, as we call it, right? The first trip of Paul, he had a companion that went with him, Barnabas. And as they set out on their journey, there was, again, as Joel read, there was a sharp, the ESV says, a sharp disagreement that occurred between them. And as you read and as you study this, it would seem that it kept coming up. The imperfect tense, that this was something that kept being brought up, that was a discussion between Paul and Barnabas. And the word here, sharp, it's a word that's used to sharpen a sword or to sharpen a knife. It was an intense, very cut and dry. Paul's over here, Barnabas is over here. And it arose on behalf of, as you're familiar with, on behalf of John Mark. Let's back up and let's read verse 40 or 36 through verse 38, which gives us the full context here of what's going on. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now, Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Now, of course, we are familiar with the work of Mark. He is, as there is little disagreement between biblical scholars, he is the author of the second book in the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. And he traveled with Paul and Barnabas on their first trip, as we find out here. But also on the first trip, he left. It didn't set well with Paul, apparently, and Barnabas is willing to give him a second chance. As we consider this disagreement that occurred over John Mark, there's 3 points that I want to bring to your attention that we can learn based on what happened here. 3 applications as we face. I'm a pretty agreeable person, and in my opinion, I've always had the right opinion. Okay, But I have talked to some people who've had the wrong opinion. So, as we have our own disagreements among ourselves, here's some things that we take from Barnabas and Paul and certainly apply to our life. And the first one, what we learn about this is this was not a damaging, by any stretch of the imagination, a damaging disagreement. And you look at it and you're like, man, Paul and Barnabas, they're through. They've been this dynamic duo like Batman and Robin ever since the beginning, and now all of a sudden they're vanished. Well, that's not the way that the New Testament portrays it. Here it might seem that way, but that's not necessarily how it all ended. And I don't know how you land on this, but a lot of times I'm like, Barnabas. I land in the camp of Barnabas. Or at least I want to. Maybe I would land in the camp of Paul, but Barnabas has always been this warm, tender-hearted, affectionate person. You remember, as we read in chapter 4, Barnabas is mentioned specifically as one of those who sold his land, right, to help those new Christians at the very beginning. And he brought it and he laid it at the apostles' feet so that they could distribute it however they saw the need. So maybe you land in, and of course, here in John Mark, he's willing to give him a second chance. But of course, with Barnabas, again, it's Barnabas who brought Paul and made Paul who he is. If you remember, you go back just a little bit and you're going to arrive in chapter 9. Paul is in Damascus. And on the road to Damascus, you remember he met the Lord or he saw the Lord. And on the road, why are you persecuting me? And who are you, Lord? And I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. Because he was trying to kill Christians, or at least, at the very least, drag them back to be tried at Jerusalem. Saw the Lord. He was baptized at the hands of Ananias. And then he tried to join and to associate with the Christians. But this is what it says, and they didn't want anything to do with it. This is what it says in chapter 9 and verse 26, where we begin reading here. And when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple, right? He's an imposter, infiltrating, he's just trying to capture us. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. I mean, again, we might land in the camp of Barnabas knowing that if it hadn't have been for Barnabas, there might not be the Paul who wrote 13 of the New Testament books. But that's not it. A couple of chapters later, Barnabas does the same thing again. You read what happens here in Acts chapter 11, you begin in verse 19, and in Acts chapter 11, Barnabas seeks Paul again. Again, there might not be Paul, who is a pillar at this church at Antioch, which, by the way, is going to send them off later, if it hadn't been for Barnabas seeking him, bringing him here, and now at the church of Antioch, they're set apart so that they can go serve the Lord together. So I'm like, yeah, I mean, Barnabas was in the right. Absolutely, we should. And maybe you find yourself like me and in need of second chance after second chance after second chance. And you're like, Barnabas was in the right. Paul, you're wrong here. But I also want to remind you of things that you already know. That later on, and this relationship wasn't damaging, because later on, Paul's going to write what we know as First Corinthians. And in First Corinthians chapter 9, he begins this discussion about financial support and how he is worthy, himself is worthy of financial support from the congregations in which he serves. As an example of that, he brings out Barnabas. Paul says that Barnabas is also deemed worthy enough to be supported financially from the churches in which he serves. So as you read that, there is no animosity of Paul towards Barnabas. The sharp disagreement, it may have affected their immediate relationship, but in the end, it wasn't damaging to their relationship in the very least. And consider Paul's relationship to John Mark. Here's an interesting tidbit. Paul writes this in Colossians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. I got to do it too. Colossians chapter 4. This is what he writes about John Mark in verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, writing, of course, from prison. And Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instruction. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, if their relationship might have been damaged from this instance, you might expect something like, well, watch out for John Mark because he deserted, and you never know when this guy's going to bail out on the gospel. When he comes to you, welcome him. I've already wrote you concerning this. Welcome that guy. He's worthy of your fellowship. But maybe the most telling to me of a relationship that is not damaged, but rather affectionate, is found in Paul's very last letter that he writes on this earth. In 2 Timothy, in the very last chapter, he gives his final instructions, and these turn very quickly, beginning in verse 9, they turn very quickly into personal requests, things that Paul wants Timothy to do for him personally, such as bring me the books and bring me my cloak, bring me my coat. This is what he writes here in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. He says, Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. The relationship that Barnabas, Paul, Silas, John Mark had, they may have been in different camps as to what needed to happen, but at the core, they remained united. And you see it with Paul's relationship to Barnabas, Barnabas's relationship with Paul, Silas, John Mark. They are all knit together with a bond of blood that is not broken. Listen, we can have disagreements. And that's okay because we're all different people. We can have differences of opinions in the way that things need to be done, but at the core, the bond of the blood of Jesus need not separate any of us from anybody. That relationship needs to remain through the disagreements, in spite of the disagreements. And that's definitely something that you learn as you read and as the broader context of Paul's life, you read this passage and you apply that context, it's definitely there. That relationship wasn't damaging in the least. But also you need to remember that this disagreement, it wasn't over doctrine. It wasn't a doctrinal issue that separated them. The doctrine of Jesus is what unites us. And when you disagree with the doctrine of the Lord, then we have a problem. That will drive a wedge between you and I. This relationship, or this division, if you will, it is by no stretch of the imagination a difference in the core beliefs and values of the Christian. And I say that for a whole host of different reasons. But one of the reasons is that maybe perhaps the main thrust is that as you read about doctrinal differences throughout the Bible, there is only one solution. There's one thing that happens over and over and over again. Let's begin. Three passages for your consideration, then we'll land at the end. Three passages. Galatians chapter 1, where we're going to begin. Look at verse 6 with me. I am astonished. Again, Paul writing, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Doctrinal differences, right? You're turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But pay attention to this in verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. There's only one gospel. There's only one basis, fundamental, foundational basis of belief of our faith. And if anyone strays from that, Paul says, let him be accursed. Puts it a different way in 1 Timothy chapter 1. He writes about a couple of different characters beginning in verse 18. One of which we might be familiar with those names, Hymenaeus and Alexander. Hymenaeus comes up more than once. But look at this, beginning in verse 18. This charge I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made about you, that by them we wage the good warfare, holding faith. Here's our doctrine. Holding faith and a good conscience. By rejecting this, some have made shipwreck the faith. ESV says there it's not a possessive, it's a singular. It is the faith. They have made shipwreck the faith, among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan that they may learn not to blaspheme. Again, the common theme throughout all of this is that if you stray from the gospel, if you stray from the faith, then let them be accursed. I've handed these people over to Satan so that they may not learn to not blaspheme. I mean, there's one goal, and it's to come back to Christ. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, well, what is that foundation? What is the fundamental belief? What is the body of doctrine that the church needs to hold on to? It's not any catechism. It's not anything that a man has ever written. It's this. And it's simple. This is what we hold on to. This is the doctrine of belief. There was in the church at Corinth, there was something that was going on that was disturbing to Paul, and certainly not right. There was a young fella there, and he was having sexual relations with his father's wife. So Paul addresses that particular topic here in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. They were abusing, it would seem, as you read 1 Corinthians chapter 5, that they were abusing the grace of God, which is a doctrinal issue. This is what Paul says in verse 11 of 1 Corinthians. In that context, in that broad context, this is what he says. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is a swindler or idolater, reviler, drunkard, or a swindler. Not even to eat with such a one. Again, swerving from the body of faith and into the world will drive a wedge between you and I. When you or I hold fast to someone or something other than this, we have a problem. What Paul and Barnabas were experiencing here was not a doctrinal issue. It was just a difference in opinion. If it were a doctrinal issue, we would have the steps or this same scenario, let him be accursed, that would be followed by Paul. But of course, that's not done. So we understand that it's not a doctrinal issue. It's just simply a difference in opinions. Their relationship, it was not damaging as we understand their life in the broader context. Here's one last point for your consideration. It wasn't distracting. And this is incredibly important. It wasn't distracting in their relationship to God. When we have disagreements among ourselves, and when we have differences of opinions, God forbid, it take our minds away from the Lord or it take our eyes off Jesus. You see, what Barnabas did, what Joel read, is there arose in verse 39, there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. And then, of course, Paul takes Silas and they go their separate way. So what happens really is a division, a separation, but by the providence of God, and because two men kept their eyes on the Lord, we have doubled our workforce. Isn't that amazing? Now, you understand Cyprus. I think this is interesting. You might not. They sail away to Cyprus. Cyprus, this little, let me see if I can do this. I am, as you are very well aware of, low-tech redneck. Here is Cyprus, right here. This little island you see. Cyprus was the home, as we gather from Acts chapter 4, I believe it's about 36. Cyprus used to be the home of Barnabas. That was where he was from. In Acts chapter 11, men came down from Cyrene and Cyprus. So the church at Jerusalem sent up Barnabas. Cyprus was, as you read in Acts chapter 13, Cyprus was where Paul and Barnabas began their first journey. In saying that, John Mark had gone with them all the way through Cyprus. So where did they return? They returned to Cyprus. The church at Cyprus was familiar with John Mark, and in fact, they didn't know that John Mark had deserted them because it wasn't until after Cyprus, as Paul says up there in Pamphylia, in particular the city of Perga, where John Mark separated. Isn't it interesting that they choose to go to Cyprus? Now, Paul, on the other hand, as we read verse 40 and verse 41, the trip continues. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Again, both still working for God. Again, you might not think it's interesting. I do think it's interesting, so you're going to listen to it. Syria and Cilicia. Again, it might not mean anything to you, but when you look at the map, you're going to get a better picture of what you're talking about here. Syria up here, just north of Jerusalem. There's an important city in Acts chapter 13 that plays a major role as a supporting role in Paul and Barnabas, Antioch. Third largest city in the known world, Antioch. Antioch is where Paul and Barnabas left to begin with. This is where it all started. So Paul goes first to Syria, to the church at Antioch, revisiting them, encouraging them, and then he moves up to Cilicia, the region of Cilicia. You're going to see that right there. In Cilicia, there's an important city to Paul deep down in his heart called Tarsus. This is Paul's hometown. So Paul goes to this as they depart. Barnabas goes to his hometown in Cyprus. Paul goes to his home church in Antioch, and from there, I can imagine, goes and sees some family and spreading the gospel in Tarsus. The work continues. There's no hard feelings, there's no disagreements here. We're just going our separate ways, and we are still keeping our eyes on Jesus. Because this is what it's all about. You go where you want to go, I'll go where I want to go, as long as we're still doing the work of God. About 200 years ago, give or take a little bit, there was a saying, as far as I know, this is when it first developed. There's a saying that I come back to over and over again that I want you to commit to your memory. In matters of doctrine, unity. In matters of opinion, liberty. In all things, love. This is what it's all about. It wasn't a doctrinal issue. It did not damage their relationship. And they kept their eyes focused on Jesus, undistracted by opinions. You may have your own opinion about who knows what. I have my opinions. And at the end of the day, nobody cares about my opinion. And it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Your opinion has no more value than mine does, and my opinion has no more value than yours does. So when we have differing opinions, we give grace. But when it comes to the Bible, we stay together. Are you in the faith of God? Have you been baptized? This is where we stand together. Every single person here is going to stand united under the foundational belief that in order to obtain the grace of God, you must be immersed in water, just as Jesus went down into the tomb. And that after that, you will be resurrected and that you will begin a new life. We all understand that you must live faithful until the end in order to obtain the crown of life, walking in the light. If you've stepped out of the light or you need to commit your life to Him, the invitation song's for you. Won't you come as we stand and sing?